Welcome to this research presentation. Today I'd like to speak with you about what's commonly referred to as the creative industries concept. This concept is now well established in research around creativity. So my role today would be to explain this concept to you, but then also talk in part 2 of this research presentation about some specific findings relevant to the creative industries in the regional tropical city of Cairns in North Queensland, Australia. So the title of my presentation is Creativity and Creative Industries in Cairns, Views from the Field. Let me begin by introducing the importance of creativity. And there's a fantastic quote by the famous educationalist and speaker, Sir Ken Robinson. And quoting Ken directly, he says, "The challenges we currently face are without precedent. More people live on this planet now than at any other time in history. The world's population has doubled in the past 30 years. So this raises serious challenges for the world, and as Ken explains, creativity is critical to solving and resolving those challenges. Bringing it back more specifically to the Australian context, recently in 2012 and then coming into 2013, there was a complete review of Australia's cultural policy, and the then Minister, the Honourable Simon Crean, referred to the importance of creativity in terms of the future of our country. In fact, quoting the Honourable Crean, his words included, "A creative nation is a productive nation." In terms of the Australian government investment in creativity, and this is an important contributor to not only creative industries, but the growth of creativity in our country, unfortunately, Australia does not fare as well as it might. For example, in comparison to Canada and New Zealand, for example, we come third in terms of investment in the arts and in creativity. And to give you those specific figures, New Zealand is first in terms of 0.198% of GDP, followed by Canada, which is 0.156% of GDP, and then Australia comes in substantially lower than that at only 0.084% of GDP. So there is some work that we need to do as a sector in lobbying government for the importance of increasing investment in creativity. So what is the creative industries? It's an often debated term. For many people, it's a vague term. One of the simplest ways to understand it is to think of two concepts: the traditional creative arts and what's also been commonly referred to as the cultural industries, or the mass media, film, television, music, radio. And if you take the first word of creative arts and the second word of cultural industries, you have creative industries. So what makes up this sector? One of the useful visual models is one created by the renowned Australian arts economist, David Throsby. And in 2001, he produced a useful visual model. Think of 3 concentric circles. At the core is the first circle of core creative arts. Creative industries relies on creativity and core creative practice. And that includes your musicians, painters, sculptors, anybody working across the performing arts field, so including dance, theatre, etc. Then if we move out more broadly to a second circle around that core creativity, is what Throsby refers to as the wider cultural industries. And as I mentioned previously, the cultural industries are your large-scale, mass media-oriented forms of practice. So film, television, radio, all the forms of media that we commonly listen to and consume on a daily basis. Then if we go one further, we move out to what Throsby refers to as related industries. And that includes the commercially focused creative practices such as architecture, design, photography, and related fields, so magazine and book publishing as well. Some even include tourism as a form of creative industries, although there is some debate around that. But certainly we could say that cultural tourism could be included in the creative industries. There are lots of other definitions and descriptions of the creative industries concept. Initially in the 90s, one came through from the British government, and since then there have been various. If you Google the term creative industries, you can find a range of definitions. But in general, they will all include core creative arts, wider cultural industries, and then related industries. So who are the players? Who are the participants in the creative industries? In general, there are three categories. The creative specialists. So again, think of those core creative arts. That's your musicians, your artists, your painters, sculptors, your playwrights, your creative writers, the people producing creative content. Our second category are what's known as support workers. So think of all the managers, the administrators, the technicians that provide support to those creatives and that help run and foster creativity in the sector. Then there's an emerging category, and this category is one of the fastest growing areas of the creative industries, and they are referred to as embedded creatives. So imagine a non-creative company such as a manufacturing car company or a building and construction company, and embedded in that company would be an in-house designer, an in-house web designer, even an in-house photographer. So they're increasingly occurring in non-creative practice and in manufacturing, building, etc. And those embeddeds offer a new category of employment for creative specialists. So let's talk about the size of the creative industries in Australia. In the 2007 to 8 year, its contribution to GDP was $31 billion. And that's significant because it's bigger than fisheries, it's bigger than forestry. So it's a very large sector in terms of its contribution to our economy. In terms of whether it imports or exports more than the other, the creative industries is a net importer, with the exception of architecture, which exports more of its services and products than any other form of creative practice. In fact, Australia's architects are renowned internationally, and particularly some of Queensland's architects who have done some incredible work overseas in places like the Middle East and others. In terms of the workforce, the creative industries represents 5.3%, and that workforce is predominantly small or micro businesses. So think of your small photography business, your small design business, but they do go right through to large organisations such as large media companies, and think of the cultural industries, radio, film, television. So it's everything in between, from a small business, including freelancers, right up to large business and even large corporations. So is it growing? Yes, it is. The creative industries in the 2006 to 2011 period grew at 2.8% nationally. And that's sourced through the data obtained by the ARC Centre of Excellence at Queensland University of Technology. And it shows that the creative industries sector actually grew faster than the rest of the economy in Australia, which grew at 2%. So it's a moving and it's a very productive sector in terms of its contribution. So is it well regarded? Is the creative industries concept supported? Certainly in both government and in academia, there are those that argue against what it represents. For example, the authors Gill and Pratt back in 2008 referred to it as simply a political rebranding of the cultural industries. And there are other authors that challenge the creative industries concept, calling it such things as an invasion of the arts by business, not enough attention on IP or intellectual property and labour markets, all about commercialisation. And that is one serious criticism of creative industries, that it takes away from the core creative arts and focuses too much on commercialisation. Nevertheless, there are those strongly in support of the concept. For example, Terry Flew and Stuart Cunningham, well-known writers around this concept, not only value the creative industries concept for what it's done to the sector in terms of highlighting its profile, but it actually helps contribute to the economy of this country and others, and it moves it out of simply relying on revenue and funding to actually being a contributor to GDP and the national economy. There's one more concept that I'll introduce which is strongly related to creative industries, and it's the concept of the creative class, which was heralded early on in the 2000s by an American cultural theorist called Richard Florida. And Richard Florida strongly supports the notion that for cities and locations to grow, one must grow the creative class. Now, what is the creative class and who are they? Essentially, Florida refers to two groups within that class. He calls the first group the super creative core, and that includes your people working in computing and maths, architecture, the arts, entertainment, and they provide a significant contribution to the creative class. Then he refers to a second group known as creative professionals. And think of those support workers, so those working in business and management and administration, but also those with a solution finding or a creative role, such as those in healthcare, for example. So the creative class is a concept that has been supported and promoted for many years, and a number of cities around the world have really worked hard to build that creative class. So recently, in a study supported by Townsville Enterprise, myself and a few colleagues in economics, we looked at the creative class concept as applied to 4 regional locations. And those locations were Cairns, Geelong in Victoria, Townsville in Queensland, and Wollongong in New South Wales. And I will add that Cairns and Townsville were 2 regional Queensland locations. So using publicly available census data and aggregating various employment, occupations and professions, we were able to give a picture of what size is the creative class in these locations. Let's look at the first 2 in Queensland, Cairns and Townsville, using the data available in 2001 and 2006. Both cities have a creative class of around about 17 to 18%, with slight growth across the period 2001 to 2006. In terms of how that fares with the other 2, to offer a point of comparison, this was slightly higher than both Geelong and Wollongong. So those 2 regional locations are doing reasonably well in Queensland, but also reasonably well in Geelong and Wollongong, where they're up around 16% as well. So these are substantial sectors of the workforce and of the population of regional and also city locations. So one of the big challenges and big opportunities for locations all around the world, and this is something Florida keeps referring to, is the importance of growing the creative class. And to finish, I'll just briefly refer to how he suggests, or what he says is necessary to grow the creative class. And keep in mind, the creative class runs or drives the creative industries, which is growing certainly in this country. So by growing the creative class, you are inherently contributing to a bigger and more influential creative industry sector. So the 3 things that Florida says are important. The first is what's there. So if you think of any location, what's there for people? Think of the built environment, the natural environment. What will actually attract people to that location? The second important issue, according to Florida, is who's there. The diversity of the people, the opportunities for people to interact, the tolerance of the culture and the people, and of course, the openness to creativity within that environment. And thirdly and finally, Florida refers to the importance of what's going on in terms of things like cafe culture, street life, the events, the arts, the performances, the opportunities for people to engage in creativity, whether as observers or as creative producers. So let me finish by wrapping up and explaining or summarising that these 2 concepts, the creative industries and the creative class, are strong concepts in contemporary research literature. It's acknowledged in government circles, it's acknowledged by city planners and by councils and all sorts of workers aiming to grow economies and growing locations. Thank you.